An important contemporary problem in the cattle industry and more generally in agriculture across the board is the matter of contribution to greenhouse gases. To understand that, we need to understand the carbon cycle. What we'll do is just quickly go through, first of all, a review of some of the science that you would have done since school. We know that plants use solar energy to capture carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and convert it into oxygen and plant material. That becomes what cows eat. And so in the cattle industry, we need at least as much pasture, grass, vegetation and so on, to be able to supply the carbon that the cows are going to eat, and in fact becomes all of the carbon that the cows are involved with. So when we look at a cow, what we're really looking at is carbon dioxide, which has been converted by the grass in the paddock it's lived in, into its meat, all of its being, and the cows exhale carbon dioxide and methane, CH4. We grow cows systematically so that we can use the food and fibre they produce. If the cows weren't in the paddocks, we would have kangaroos and wombats and who knows what running around and doing something similar. That's the carbon cycle. We often now talk about the problem of methane in the atmosphere and the contribution that cows make to methane production and carbon dioxide. So we'll briefly have a look at what methane is and how it fits in the cycles in the surface of the planet. Methane. Methane, a simple organic molecule, very common, similar to propane, which is our barbecue fuel. It's flammable. It easily breaks down to carbon dioxide and water following a fairly simple chemical reaction. Carbon dioxide and water are both nutrients for plants. It's what they need. And so as methane reacts with the oxygen in the air and produces carbon dioxide and water, it actually becomes plant nutrient. It's actually produced in one of the stomachs. Cattle, unlike people, have two stomachs. One is where the grass they eat goes and sits. And due to bacteria inside the cattle stomach, it turns into chemicals that actually support the cow. So the cow doesn't actually live on grass. It lives on the chemicals that the bacteria living inside the cow's stomach produce. There's this nice symbiotic arrangement inside the cow. This is significant in the popular discourse because we often talk about methane as though it's this dreadful chemical that comes from the tail end of cows and is obnoxious and problematic and poisonous to the atmosphere and so on. The reality is that they actually belch out the methane. In other words, they exude it through their mouths, which is a lot more becoming than coming out of the other end. And it's a natural part of the carbon cycle. The carbon itself, of course, comes from the grass that the cows have been eating, which in turn comes from photosynthesis and the carbon dioxide which has been captured by the grass the cows eat. That is, every molecule of methane that the cow produces, or rather the bacteria inside the cow produces, actually comes exactly from carbon dioxide which has been captured by the cow's food, the grass. This is important when we go back to our diagram, because now when we look at what the cow produces, principally carbon dioxide, methane and manure, apart from the cow's body, which people tend to use for things like leather and steak and whatnot, the carbon dioxide, methane and manure are all vital to the plants as plant food. Plants need the chemistry in the cow's manure as fertilizer. The carbon dioxide is to the plant what oxygen is to us. It's what plants need to breathe in order to operate. And the methane, because of this process, breaks down to carbon dioxide, in other words, plant food, and water. Again, plants need water. Okay, so that makes the methane look a lot less problematic. Okay, yet we are told that the agriculture is one of the greatest producers of greenhouse gases on the planet. Why is that, if we're talking about something which is essentially a closed-loop cycle? And the reason is, in order to consider agriculture, and especially the cattle industry, as a massive greenhouse gas producer, we have to ignore half of the cycle in which the cow operates, the cattle operate. We have to ignore the paddocks and the grass and so on that the cows eat. If the cows don't eat the grass, in other words, if the grass doesn't exist, cows wouldn't exist, so we wouldn't have anything there. And yet we're given the impression that cows somehow simply produce methane especially, and causing problems to the atmosphere. If we are going to penalise the cattle industry for their greenhouse gas production, well, obviously this fake greenhouse accounting ignores half of the cycle, so it's not really honest science. But as well as that, in practice, if the solution is to get rid of all the cows, go out and shoot them all, we would also have to make sure that wildlife doesn't flourish to basically rage over the paddocks and take over where the cows left off. The only difference between having kangaroos and wombats and so on, maybe feral cats and pigs, is that they don't produce useful things for humanity. It's really the only difference. But certainly you can imagine that if pasture is left out without active use, not used for the cattle industry, it's not all going to turn into forests. You're going to end up with something like the African savannas. So the grass will continue, but wildlife will flourish. To a certain extent, it's good having wildlife around. But what it means is that in order to reduce the net effect, you would have to remove all the wildlife. In other words, actively kill it and cull it and keep it away. You also have to ignore what will happen when you take all of the animal life away from the countryside, and that is ignore the fact that the manure from cows and also from wildlife, kangaroos, wombats, whatnot, feral pigs, feral cats, is necessary for the plants in order to fertilise them. That is, if you were to effectively remove the animals from the countryside, you would also eventually kill off the grass, because it won't flourish where you don't have that natural cycle replenishing the fertility of the soil.